How did you go from, well, directing Bridget Jones to getting involved in online safety?
I was a movie director. I was working between LA and London, and I used to make documentaries on things that were of interest to me in between the movies. And in 2012, when a smartphone became the price point that an adult would give one to a kid, I walked into my kitchen and I found 4 15-year-old girls silent on the sofa. And I thought, oh, that is weird. Yeah, girls aren't silent on the sofa together. I wonder what it's like to grow up here, i.e. in my kitchen, and there. And then I thought, where's there? And 3 weeks later, I had picked up my camera, I'd started making a film. I have just met Ollie, who worked on the film. There you go. I haven't seen him since. But we made a film and spent hundreds of hours in the bedrooms and lives of children, and also followed the tech to America and all the way to Silicon Valley, where I was kicked off a lot of headquarters, because they care about their privacy quite a lot, though not ours. And somewhere in the middle of it, a guy called Nick Negroponte, who was a very famous futurist in the area of tech, one of the early founders, he just said to me, look, you know, this is going to be democratic, this is no gatekeepers, and all users will be equal. And when he said all users will be equal, I had a sort of a mad moment where everything kind of that I'd seen in the bedrooms of children kind of went brrr through my brain. And I realized that was a category error. Because if you treat all users as equal, you're treating a kid as if they're an adult. And actually a child is a child until they reach maturity, not until the moment they pick up a smartphone. And I'd recently been put in the Lords. I had quite a good phone book from being a director. I tried to tell the tech companies, I tried to tell the children's charities. No one was interested. It was tech was the future. It was all new rock and roll. And I thought, this is a generational injustice. And I've never made another film since. I became a campaigner for child rights online. So that's how I got here.
It's interesting because what you're suggesting there is that these tech companies think that everyone is equal once they enter the marketplace of the internet. So but by that supposition, it's a democratic place. But that is not how you see it at all.
No, exactly. And democracy isn't treating absolutely everybody, irrespective of their capacity, their condition, equally. It's about having opportunity. You know, it's about having the right conditions for human flourishing in each case, yeah? And I think the thing that has happened over the period that I've been doing this, we've watched them go into market after market after market, and what they are is market controllers, yeah? Rather than necessarily innovators. A lot of the time, they're not doing something new. Uber doesn't get you from A to B in a different way from a black cab or an old cab used to. It actually captures your data, takes a bit from the driver. You know, it's an exchange point rather than an innovation point. And what they were doing was just not recognizing children as anything but a market. And that, I felt, was an injustice, because children are not just a market. And in fact, although I have always thought that children were just the clearest way of seeing a much bigger problem, and also probably an issue over which you could get most agreement in terms of bipartisanship, actually, children also have enhanced set of rights and legal protections, right? So I thought, if we can prove it here for the under 18s, then we can prove it for the rest of us. And I think what is really interesting is the level of pushback from the companies is really because 1 in 3 people online is under the age of 18. That is a huge market, right? And they have been very reluctant to give it away. And I do, in the book, detail some of their reluctance in quite in quite graphic detail.
It's rather stark. Let's stay on that pushback for a moment there, because whenever this topic is discussed on broadcast, you'll have someone there from some sort of think tank who will say something on the lines of, well, it is within your own gift to switch off. It's within your own gift to just put your phone down. And as a parent, perhaps you should be more involved in your children's lives and you shouldn't allow them access. What would you say to that line of thinking?
So I'll say two things. I mean, one is I currently have a position in Oxford at the AI Ethics Centre, and I was talking to a colleague a couple of years ago, and he said 50% of my behavioural psychologists go straight into big tech. And he goes, and that's not unusual for any university. So the first thing I'll say is, it's not a fair fight. They've got UX designers, they've got behavioural psychologists, they've got armies of people designing it to be addictive. So the idea you can just put it down, I mean, I doubt if there's anyone in the room who can just put it down. You have to have a conscious effort to renegotiate your relationship with something that is deliberately designed to addict you. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I think, you know, this idea that somehow that they are neutral and not responsible. And I do in the book, I actually explain why there is a plausible story for their exceptionality, you know. But what I did in order to sort of tackle that issue is actually the second chapter of the book is actually about how the mechanics of addiction. But I use the case study of sex, because what I'm trying to say is if they can change the sexual appetites of an entire generation, then they can change anything. And you can see in increments how it is changed. And I use all sorts of examples, and they are from the absolutely dark and horrendous examples around you know, the rise of AI child sexual abuse, to actually young men going, you know, off to university, starting their new life and thinking what they are doing is normal and ending up with a barrister and a sexual complaint, yeah? And that how it is that the design of technology and the pervasive pushing of pornography onto young men has made that reality. So the point is not to be, you know, particularly high moral tone, and that's not my style. And in fact, before I made In Real Life, I had made two films, one in America, one in India, about prostitution. And so actually I have a very intimate knowledge about pornography and prostitution and over the years and so on. So I use sex because I just think that if you understand that desire can be shifted, then you begin to understand that it's not a fair fight. Yeah, especially if you're a child.
And how behavioural norms have changed.
Yeah.
Or been massaged, actually, by these tech companies.
Yeah.
Let's just do a quick focus group here. So how many of you would say you're addicted to your phones? And how many of you are lying? The rest of you. Let's stay on the topic of addiction. So you've described big tech and social media as needing its big tobacco moment. What do you mean by that?
So I'll just start by saying what I don't mean, because I have been misunderstood. I don't mean that social media is like tobacco and intrinsically cancerous. What I mean is that for decades, in the smoking arena, it was considered personal choice. Yeah? And then they got to this point where they thought, hang on a minute, the research shows that they know you're going to be addicted, and that people knew that they were going to be hurt, and they knew that they were going to get cancer. And it became a series of court cases about product safety, about literally who knew what, when, and whether they were responsible, liable for that. Now, we've had some court cases earlier this year in America, and for the first time, we're away from whether this is freedom of speech, and we're into what? Who knew what when about how it made girls anxious? Who knew what when about the fact that TikTok was, took 35 minutes to become compulsive? Who knew what when about predators in particular environments? And actually, the disclosure, which is part of the American system, legal system, what we get to see, and I have spent hours looking at them, is the company conversations with itself. So one person in the company talking to another person in the company, sort of saying, hey, I think there's a problem because there's a swarm of men sort of looking for children to, predators looking for kids, and they go, oh, well, get them off for a week. And they go, but they're coming back. And they go, oh, get them off for a week. And it takes them 12 times to actually ban the guys, and then they don't ban them from the site. They just ban that one channel, and so they come back on another channel, and it all starts again. And so once the judges start seeing that, they go, well, hang on a minute, you're liable for your product, not for speech, but for the design of the product. And that's why it's the tobacco moment, because that changes everything. When the legal view of what tech is, it's not a pipe, it's not neutral, it is knowingly doing harm, it is liable, that changes the conversation.
And if you're not familiar, so there has just been a landmark case in the United Kingdom, which is with Google and YouTube, and it is that a woman has been proving that she was addicted to YouTube, and therefore they should have some kind of corporate responsibility. Google are appealing, YouTube are appealing, they're arguing that they've got nothing to do with it, which seems unusual. Why would they not want to accept any responsibility? So what do you think about that? When do you think the individual is no longer responsible and it becomes a corporate issue?
So I actually think there's never a moment in which we are all individually devoid of all responsibility. I mean, we have choices, we can make choices. But I think that, an easy way of looking at it is perhaps, cars. The car has to have shatterproof windows and the brakes have to work and it needs an airbag and da-da-da. But actually the street also has zebra crossings and lights and red, yellow things. But also we have to learn how to drive and we can't just go without. And actually pedestrians, even they have responsibilities in the space. And then the whole thing is policed in different ways, yeah? So everybody has a responsibility, and I would probably maintain we all have a responsibility in a similar sense, but actually allowing the car to have no brakes, to run amok, to be on the top of the hill with a kid in the wheel, is actually irresponsible in itself. And so, by the time I get to the end of the book, I actually do two things. I put one set of things that governments must do, and the way we have to reorder our relationship with tech, bring it into the rules of democracy, a democratic life in many different ways. But I also put a list of things which is, hey, here's what we can do. And that might be, in your own life, it might be to do with your kids, it might be to do with your workplace. But I do make quite a big bid that we also have to think about our democratic rights in relation to this. And because I've just published a book, I've been in a few rooms like this. And on the first one, it was about South by Southwest. So it's really people totally focused on tech, yeah? And someone asked me a question, don't remember what the question was, but in the answer I said, would anybody who voted at the last election based on the party's tech policy put their hand up? 0. Anybody in this room? 0. I'm getting on for 3,000 people. Not one person has made it their priority, and yet our entire life is interneted. It is in health, it is in education, it's in communication, it's in media, it's in finance. There is nothing that has not been affected by big tech. And so one of the things that I think we're going to have to do is actually make it a question of our vote. And I think, and we may get to it eventually, we may not get to it, but if you look at what happened with the phone ban, that was based on MPs' inboxes. Keir Starmer didn't announce it because he thought it was a good policy. He announced it because his backbenchers said, we are not going to be re-elected if we don't do this. Now, whatever you think of the phone ban, just think about that power move, right? It is in your hands. And to be honest, you know, I'm going to fight every day of my life on this issue. That's what I do. I get up in the morning and think, how can I do it? And I have actually passed laws, and I work internationally, and we pass laws internationally. But actually, it's not going to work until everybody in this room is an activist on this issue. And that's why I wrote the book, was to say, look, here's the story, here's my story. I had a really good life, gave it up to do this, but actually I can't do this without all of you.
That's really interesting. So we were expecting, weren't we, the Prime Minister to announce that phone ban at the beginning of London Tech Week. And then he gave a rather sheepish speech in which he sort of skirted around it. And you thought, OK, well, perhaps it's difficult to be in a room full of the tech giants and argue something like that. Anyway, and then it came a week later. Let's talk about actually your Parliament work. So as a parliamentarian, I mean, you bring in these people, you bring in tech bosses to ask them questions under Parliament oath, right? And you line them up and you fire off questions. And you know what? Sometimes it's a bit of a difficult watch. You can watch all of this on Parliament TV if you're so inclined. Are you ever frightened? I mean, you're really, you know, you're facing off against arguably people who are oligarchs, sometimes even potentially criminal. Are you ever frightened when you're asking the questions that you do to them?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, you know, I did once leave the house and I said, if I'm ever at the bottom of the river, it's Meta what did it. But that was more of a domestic issue. No, but you know, you know, in the book, I do talk about not everything, because the lawyers at the publishers weren't happy with everything. But I do talk about some of the things that show how far it goes. And I would say, you know, there's one story where in order to get attention of the government, who were being lobbied not to take seriously the problem of AI, child sexual abuse, I had the specialist cops who work in that area undercover make child abuse out of my parliamentary photograph. And I said, this will be on News at 10 if you don't agree. Yeah? There is another time when I actually said more directly to Google about something very, very, very serious, that I would do something and they believed me that I would. But you can't always play that game. But I've been pretty outrageous. And yeah, I do sometimes go home and go, what the F have I just done? And also it did the work that I did in America that was ultimately supported by Gavin Newsom, governor of California. You know, the State Department opened a foreign interference case on me. And I thought, how did I get here where, you know, it's sort of Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Beeban? You know, that's just not a cognitive list. So I won't say I'm so much frightened as I am enraged. And sometimes, I'm going to admit, sometimes I'm really upset. There have been moments where, you know, I mean, I see three evils in the room. One is the companies, one is the lobbyists, and one is the governments who are lobbied. And sometimes, and I suppose, you know, sometimes opposition parties that don't do the right thing because they think they might be in power sometime. You know, that sends me into a world, but I don't think it's fear. I think it's frustration.
There's a question I want to ask you, which is, why do you think governments are so reluctant to impose legislation? And then as I'm asking that, I'm thinking, Donald Trump, just a couple of months ago, had said any European nation who imposes a digital services tax will in return receive a 100% import tax into the US. So, you're not going up against private companies here. You're actually going up against, arguably, the President of the United States.
Yeah, I suppose so.
She's laughing. She's laughing.
I think I called him the big orange monster on the radio this week. I'm worried about my trip to America. No, I think, okay, so because I wrote the book over the last year, so one of the things that sort of accidentally comes through in the book is that in the background, there is the UK-US trade deal. And I think that what I would say to the room is, first of all, they go, oh, we don't like your steel, and then we don't like your biofuels, and then we don't like your digital tax, and then they don't like your child protection, and then they don't like, creative copyright. That was the fight last year, And then they actually want a little bit more access to the NHS, and then actually, they want to be in your security system. All I would say is we still don't have a deal, right? There is no UK-US trade deal. And so, I think one of the big mistakes of the Starmer government was to try and be close to Donald Trump. And the reason that that government was worse than 14 years of Tory government on tech is because they were trying to keep close for the trade deal. So, yeah, that is the choice. Where I go to is, I think there's three things. One is, Donald Trump doesn't, only responds to strong people, so you may as well take the strong position rather than the weak one if you're talking about it individually, as a single powerful person. I think the second thing is that it isn't a choice between our regulation and laws and values and no regulation. It's a choice between ours and actually being run by the terms of service of Silicon Valley. Yeah, and the rules of the American courts. And so it's an absolute question of sovereignty and of dependence. And as America walks in the direction it's walking, I don't think dependence on that is a good look. I think the third thing I want to say, and I've just come back from Europe, is that's the bit I don't understand. 500 million people, huge single market. They haven't managed to sort of look inwards and say, actually, here, there's China, there's America, there's us. And in fact, I would say in this last time, over the last couple of years, they have gone backwards. And I think there's a load of very detailed reasons why that is, some of which to do with Brexit, some of which to do with who's joined the EU, some of which is to do with the current leadership, etc., etc. But I think that the big opportunity was to actually put a third set of values in tech, because there's a huge market. And then finally, what I'd say is, I think there's quite a lot of optimism amongst people like me who are not anti-tech. It's sort of like, it's not what tech can do, but it's what tech has become. That actually the big moment around DeepSeek and narrow, seeing cheaper AI, that a lot of people are looking at the tech and going, actually, bigger is not necessarily better. In order to cure cancer, you don't really need to be able to translate the Bible into Arabic with one press. And that actually there is a huge role in having trusted, narrow, single-issue tech. And we here in the UK are perfectly positioned for that market. And I'm hoping that the new government will actually build on that thought, because we have some of the best data in the world.
It's really interesting, because what you're essentially saying is that, you're not attempting to limit advancements that can be made with technology. What you're saying is that perhaps it's not healthy that an app knows that your child is 14 years old and likes wearing Reebok trainers. perhaps that's not a good thing. Perhaps there should be more tighter legislation around it.
Or actually, that they are 14 years old, they last woke up at, 17, that they're 4'2", they like Reebok's Jonas, and then sends them self-harm. That's what I don't like. It's the combination of absolute knowledge around commercial facts and deliberate willful blindness around social facts. And I think that is unsustainable. And there's a Facebook, as was, whistleblower, Arturo Bear, and I was with him quite recently, and he did this wonderful thing with his hands. I don't know if I can do it with the microphone, but he goes, he makes that shape, huge funnel. He goes, there's 1 billion kids in the world online. Only a few hundred of them will die. But there are so many layers of anxiety, of self-harm, of addiction, and so on. And it's not the bad, guys. It's the opportunity cost. It's what they're not doing. So if they're 2, they're not crawling. And if they're less than 2, they're not speaking. And if they're teenagers, they're not, running around and looking each other in the eye. And all the things that they need to grow, is what they are missing. And instead, there's this really irresponsible blindness that will sell them the shoes, but it won't respect their age. And that is the toxic mix. It's what you're missing, it's who you are, and it's why you're being given what you're being given. And if it was a more plural, if there were more services with more ideas about what they were doing, it would be a very different thing. So actually, one of the future things is going to be competition law, anti-lobbying law, etc., etc.
I always think that. I think everything I've learned about Joe Rogan, I've learned against my will. It's just been served to me. I want to go back to the second point that you made in your previous answer there, where you were talking about democracy and you're talking about Silicon Valley in the vein of Trump. I mean, there's an argument, really, that this is not, the freedom that is apportioned to tech companies is not even something that Donald Trump perhaps wants himself. He is being lobbied on behalf of Silicon Valley. So is there an argument here that the lack of democracy is because the laws and legislation are not being made by any government of the world? They are being made by a couple of billionaires.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think one of the interesting facts, and it came from a really interesting source, was that so I was talking to someone in the security community. I realized that just like the kids thing is a good lens from which to see this, so is security, national security, particularly now with the sort of powerful AI. So I was talking to someone in the security company, in the security space, very high up in Biden's administration. And what they said was, look, we did some research about why it is democracy wasn't working. And what we found was until sort of mid-1980s, people represented their states, So if you came from Texas, you did oil, and if you came from California, you did entertainment, and, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, from the mid-80s, that Congress and Senate have disproportionately, overwhelmingly represented the top 10% of companies, i.e. the lobby, right? And that is why it has ground to a halt, and that is why they can't make any laws, because everybody's bought off. So when I was writing the book, I go, okay, how many people who sit on those powerful committees inside Congress and Senate are backed by tech? 96%. Yeah? So they walk into it with the lobby that helped them get there as their best friend. So some of it is justified, and some of it is actually the game I've seen particularly in America. The game is a sort of a performative politics. So they bring them all in, they shout at them, and they put clips out for their constituents, but nothing ever changes. And if you notice, if you look closely at the debate we all had about creative copyright last year, That's exactly what happened here. Exactly what happened here. Yeah? It was very, very performative from the government. But actually, and I have to say, there is the proof, and there is the scene with the Secretary of State written in my book. I decided to go be open because I'm so disgusted by it. But it wasn't about Parliament. It wasn't about votes. It wasn't about what was good for Britain. It was about the trade deal. Contingent is the word he used. Contingent. And that is 2.4 million people, in the creative industries. And it is actually it's our second biggest industry in this country, and it is an enormous loss for household prosperity, national prosperity, and all this talk about growth, is completely misleading if the growth is offshore.
The conversation about AI has dominated broadsheets now for the past year or so. We're always hearing AI is about to take our jobs. And funnily enough, actually, what you've just said has reminded me, there was a rather nice, fluffy acknowledgement from Keir Starmer when, among others, Dua Lipa and Elton John submitted a letter that said, you need to bring in greater protections because people are taking our work. Machine learning is adopting what we are doing, and it is just replicating it, and you need to stop this from happening. And there was a rather fluffy response from Keir Starmer, which is, whatever Dua Lipa's doing, I'm doing it too. Maybe that was me, I don't know. Let's talk a little bit about AI. Tell me about your concerns, especially with what you've been working on around copyright.
Well, maybe entertain everyone to know that I was actually, hiding behind the pot plant in Elton's room when he called the Secretary of State a moron on telly. And that is in the book, and how that all happened is in the book. But, I think the copyright is another way. So what I try and do is try and bring together what I feel is very important, because I'm in this fight, so, I'm largely associated with two issues. One is child safety and the other is copyright. But actually, I have colleagues, who are looking at sovereignty. There's information integrity, there's the joblessness issue coming up, et cetera, And what I'm trying to say in the book is these are all the same fight. Yeah, they're all this idea that they live outside of the rules of society, and that gives them freedom to move in to any market, make it free or cheap, knock out everybody else, make it expensive, either in money or data or social cost, and then get more powerful, and then determine the politics that sit around all of that. And then they're free to do it again. And that cycle. So I think that this question of copyright really is another lens. It's another very clear lens. I make something, I do something, I create something. That is my moral right. It's also my property. And here we had a government that was, rather than saying, do you know what, they've been nicking, thieving for a decade or more, what we'll do, because they've asked us, is give it away for free. Yeah? And my point to the government is, A, that's very stupid. Yeah? I hope I said it more sophisticated manner. But B, it's not yours to give away. Yeah? And I think that I just want you to hold that in mind when in 3 months you hear that the NHS reform bill is going through Parliament. If they get all of the NHS data, that is privatisation of the NHS by stealth, the back door. And we here in the UK who use the NHS may in the future not be able to afford the things that learning brings, yeah? Because they will have been privatised. I'm all for the learning, yeah? We want the learning, but we want it to be on, like they say in football, 50+1. We have to have it in national hands, and we have to have control over it sort of moral control. And I think that is the battle. We did half win the battle on copyright, and I think that the new government will be more sympathetic, and they certainly do not have a mining exception, and there's been a lot more deals made since. But it has been catastrophic for the creative industry.